Here we go. Introduce Catherine Chan, who's an assistant professor at the University of Macau. She published a book, was it just last year?
Yeah.
Last year on, got the title somewhere, the Macanese diaspora in British Hong Kong. And the paper you're giving today is related to this. And it is on, I've got too many pieces of paper. It's called Splinter Bonds, Macanese diaspora in British Hong Kong. And we'll look at narratives of six men to make a broader case. And I'm very much looking forward to it because it's a bit out of the ordinary for us. So it'll be exciting to broaden our horizons a bit, I reckon. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen first. All right. So thank you, Bernard, for inviting me, and thank you, Claudia, for organizing this, although I wasn't answering her emails. Hope she didn't mind.
Because you didn't get them.
Right, so my talk today is based primarily on my book, as Claudia had already introduced, The Macanese Diaspora in British Hong Kong, a century of trans-imperial drifting, that I published with Amsterdam University Press around this time last year, in fact. And today I'll be drawing on bits and pieces of biographical narratives. I've got 5 narratives today. And if my book were a cake, today we'll be expecting to see some of the more colorful sprinkles on top of that cake. And to start with, before I start, some of you may not know who the Macanese are or where. And frankly, although I've been working on this community for about 6 years now since my PhD, I still don't really have a clear-cut idea of how to define or how to come up with a line or two that encapsulates the entire community that's today spread all over the world. But in my work, I narrowed down the Macanese to look at those who moved to Hong Kong, and probably from Hong Kong to elsewhere, between the years 1841 and 1941. So in general, I would loosely define them as Luso-Asians with Macau roots. That means to say that they would have had ancestors from Portugal, or they could have had ancestors that moved to Macau in the 16th century who were from the Portuguese overseas colonies. So they could have been Goan people, or they could have come from Southeast Asia as well. And in general histories, the marginalized have been, the Macanese have so far been marginalized in broader histories that they had taken part in. In Macau studies, for example, the narratives often tell us about the Macanese as a homogeneous community. So they are one, they are not separated, they've got great solidarity, and there are 2 basic characteristics that are often used to pinpoint to the Macanese. First is that they are Catholics. And today, this is probably still one of their cultural markers. And back in the 19th century, when they first moved to Hong Kong, this was an important identity marker for the Macanese. They would be found huddling and residing in a certain area in Central that was walking distance to the first Catholic church in Hong Kong. But today, many of them have openly told me that, yeah, I am Catholic if you ask me, but I'm not really Catholic in the sense that I don't go to the church anymore. I don't pray. And it doesn't really matter. But it would matter if I told people that I am not Catholic, because that would create a lot of drama. And that would probably, lead to the older generations thinking that I'm not qualified to be a Macanese or a Portuguese. And apart from that, the second cultural characteristic is that they have a creolized language of their own that's called patois. The word patois is, of course, not unique to the Macanese, but the Macanese version of patois is unique in the sense that it reflects on their historical background. They have loan words, for example, from the Malay language, and Bernard would know this. They use the word nyania, that Bernard would know refers to girl in the Straits Settlement. They say kopo-kopo when they talk about butterflies. And they've also loaned words from the Chinese language that they learned after coming to Macau. So these include, for example, lap sap, which means rubbish in Cantonese. And also they use the word li shi, which in Mandarin and also in Cantonese refers to red pocket money. that the elder generation hands out to the younger generation during Chinese New Year. And this also goes to show that they have adopted certain Chinese cultural traditions because of the time that they spent in Macau. And in the histories of the Portuguese Empire, the Macanese are often just known as Portuguese subjects that have come from other Portuguese colonies and settled down in Macau during and after 1557, when Macau came to be leased to the Portuguese people. And that's basically just about it. You find scattered narratives, bits and pieces about Macanese people. Usually they're not called Macanese in these literature, so they're often just called the Portuguese from Macau. And these narratives show that they have done trading, especially in opium, using Portugal's imperial networks, especially with Southeast Asia and with South Asia. And in the general histories of British Hong Kong, we find that the Macanese have been shrunk into a small group of people, and usually they're known as a homogeneous group of people that serve as intermediaries in administrative offices. And that's because, especially in the 19th century, the Chinese majority had yet to learn the English language, but the Macanese, they could read and write general English, and they were able to speak the Cantonese language. And that led to the general impression that they served as intermediaries in Hong Kong. But there's more to that. And a lot of the narratives regarding the Macanese in British Hong Kong's history talk mostly about their achievements in helping to build Hong Kong from nothing to a cosmopolitan city. So all of these, I don't deny, they're not incorrect, they're not inaccurate, but I try to deviate away from too generalized observations regarding the Macanese. And that is why today, in the first part of my presentation, I'll try to use 5 different figures, biographies as a stencil in order to illustrate in the second part of my presentation the impacts of trans-imperial migration on mixed-race migrant communities. And that means to say that I will touch on issues of glass ceilings, of racial restrictions in the colonial setting. I will touch on issues of Anglicization, and finally the impacts of these on the solidarity of the Macanese community. So ultimately, using my talk or my presentation today, I hope to show that when we look into stories of tears, of sweat and blood, of personal struggles, of glass ceilings, when we look into the narratives of rather relatively neglected communities, we are actually making and creating space for plural histories that regard all actors as subjects in their own right. And that's ultimately what I do hope to show in today's presentation. Nothing too fancy, but something that I found quite meaningful in my own work. The first figure that I want to talk about is a man called Leonardo de Almada Castro. So Leonardo was born in 1815 in Goa to a Portuguese lieutenant father and a Goan-born mother. The family moved to Macau when Leonardo was age 10. We don't know much about his childhood, but we know that when he was 21, during 1836, Leonardo was already working for the office of the British Superintendency of Trade. And on February 27, 1842, he would become one of the first 2 Macanese men to enter Hong Kong as part of a chosen entourage to help establish British governance over that island. And the other Macanese man was, in fact, his younger brother, Jose Maria de Almada de Castro. And in British Hong Kong, Leonardo's career would see very quick ascension. In 1844, he was appointed as the chief clerk of the Colonial Secretary's office. 1847, he was promoted to clerk of the 2 councils, so that's the legislative and the executive council. But for the most part, when we read about Leonardo in today's existing histories, we'll find that he is mostly remembered and known as a victim of racial prejudice and racial discrimination. And that's because in the 1850s, Leonardo wanted to advance his career. And he had expected that he would be promoted to the position of colonial secretary, which technically was the second highest ranking political office in Hong Kong, just next to the office of the governor. And that didn't happen because Leonardo was not as educated as his British counterparts, and also just very practically because Leonardo was a Macanese and he was not a British. And so in 1854, when all else has failed, in fact, from 1851 to about 1854, he began writing letter after letter to the colonial office to complain against his British colleagues for racial discrimination and for not allowing him to take on the position of the colonial secretary. And all of these would fail. And in 1854, he would apply to be naturalized as a British subject. But this legislation would not be enacted until 1881 at least. And so Leonardo would not be able to succeed in doing so. And he would die in Hong Kong in 1875, still in his position as the chief clerk of the two consuls and the clerk of the colonial secretary's office. And so for the most part, we can say that Leonardo's life has been narrowed down and shrunk into a particular narrative that is often applied to the Macanese in Hong Kong. And this narrative is something that Montalto de Jesus in his 1926 book would describe as, quoting, hapless descendants of once affluent Macanese families vegetating as underpaid, overworked, browbeaten clerks, mean advantage being taken of their distress and endurance until they died, usually in harnessed martyr-like ordeal. And what I'm going to tell you about in the second part of this presentation is that when we move beyond seeing Leonardo just as a victim of racial discrimination in British Hong Kong, there's so much more that we can learn about him. And there's so much more that we could learn about his community and Hong Kong by doing so, but that's for later. The second figure that I want to introduce is called Eduardo Pereira. Eduardo was born in 1817 in Macau, and he was born to Antonio Pereira and Aurelia Viana Mendes. He was the grandchild of Manuel Pereira, who was one of the two richest Macanese men to be trading opium with the British in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And his family would build a close friendship with the British East India Company. His grandfather, Manuel, had a house called the Casa Garden, and it's still here today in Macau. And it's today the headquarters of the Orient Foundation of Macau. And they leased part of Casa Garden to the British East India Company as their headquarters. And in different diaries and journals, we found that Casa Garden was a space wherein this Macanese family, the Pereira family, mingled with middle-class foreigners in Macau, including the traders who were working for the British East India Company. So Manuel Pereira's networks to the British, that would be brought forward, and it would continue to work in facilitating negotiations and trade deals between the Macanese and the British community. And in the 1830s, records show that Eduardo Pereira worked as an agent in the opium trade with the British. A record from 1839 shows that he was the only Macanese to enter the opium trade with the British Superintendent's Office in Macau. And after 1842, when Hong Kong became a British colony, Eduardo Pereira decided to relocate to Hong Kong. And according to the Directory of China, he in 1844, 1845 would work for about 2 years as a clerical assistant for Dent & Co. But then after those 1.5 or 2 years, he was promoted to a partner of Dent & Co. And this was very unusual in 1840s Hong Kong. And what we suspect is that Eduardo Pereira had always been a partner. His family had always been business partners with Dent & Co. But he had to come to Hong Kong and familiarize himself with the company before taking on the official position of a partner of Dent & Co. And as I said, this was very unusual, and this is not an observation that only I have made, because Stuart Braga has also described Eduardo Pereira as, quoting, the most completely anglicized of all the Macanese. And this was at a time when most Macanese would come to Hong Kong and work as lower or middle-ranking clerks for the government and for foreign enterprises. But Eduardo, not only a partner to a foreign company, in 1847, he was elected as a residential member of the Hong Kong branch of the Royal Asiatic Society, although this was very short-lived as an organization. So he was elected alongside people like Major Kane, Wilkinson Dent, and in 1859, Eduardo would become Edward as he moved to London. So I'm going to talk about this in the second part of the presentation. He would die in London, 1872, of lung cancer. My third figure is Jose Pedro Braga. Often we call him as JP because that's how he would write his name usually in his publications. JP Braga was born in 1871 in Hong Kong to a well-to-do family. His grandfather was Delfino Noronha, and Delfino was one of the first generation Macanese migrants that have settled in Hong Kong and established a very successful printing company called Noronha and Sons. So experts of the print culture in the Straits Settlement, Canton, and Shanghai would have heard the word Noronha because he would later set up branches of his company in these port cities that would be run by his children. So Delfino Noronha was instrumental in orchestrating young Braga's life and path to Anglicization. Unlike Leonardo Diamante Castro, who was born at a time when naturalization was still not yet possible, and unlike Eduardo Pereira, who was born with a silver spoon and already had connections to the British people through his family, young Braga was sent to Calcutta to study in St. Xavier's College and Roberts College, both of which were attended by middle-class, well-to-do Eurasians and European children. In 1889, JP would return to Hong Kong when he would start working for his grandfather at Noronha and Sons. And it was during this time that JP Braga began to indulge himself in writing pieces that were not exactly against the British government, but they were criticism of Hong Kong society. So one of them was published in 1895 called The Rights of Aliens in Hong Kong. I remember it as a 98-page pamphlet. It's quite slender. And it served as simultaneously an ode to the British Empire, because on the first page, we see a very big picture of the governor of Hong Kong at that time. And it also served as a voice for non-British alien workers in Hong Kong who were facing discrimination, who were being paid very little money, but were working very long hours because, as J.P. Braga stated, they were not British people. They were aliens and were treated like aliens in Hong Kong. In the 1900s, JP would leave Noronha and Sons because Delfino would pass away and his children would kick JP Braga out of the company. He would become the managing editor of Hong Kong Daily, the Hong Kong Telegraph, and he was also a correspondent for Reuters. And JP Braga would, in 1929, make a milestone because he would become the first ever Macanese to enter the Legislative Council as an unofficial member of the LegCo. In the 1940s, JP Braga would move to Macau during the Second World War, and he did so very unwillingly because he felt like he had spent his whole life trying to build his career, and he got there, but then if he left Hong Kong, he'd have to forfeit everything. But he had no choice, so he left for Macau, and he would die there in 1944 because of illness. My second to the last figure is Carlos Augusto Montalto de Jesus, often known as C.A. Montalto de Jesus. So you can see that in the name. He uses C.A. Montalto de Jesus in his publications as well. Montalto was born in 1863 as the eldest of 8 children to Joao, who was a clerk for the company Turner & Co., and Linda Mira, who was the daughter of an Italian who moved to Hong Kong during the 1840s. We really don't know much about Montalto's childhood, except that he attended St. Joseph's College, which was a school attended by a lot of Portuguese boys. And he would later, upon graduation, work as a clerk for the Hong Kong Bank and Jardine Matheson & Co. But all of this did not make Montalto happy. So he wanted more than that. He wanted to be recognized as someone with great achievements. And so he would use some of his Portuguese networks. And by the 1890s, He had become a member of the Lisbon Geographic Society. He's often seen giving talks in Shanghai to the China branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. In 1902, he would publish Historic Macau, which is, by that time, in 1902, was probably the first ever, most extensive history of Macau as a Portuguese colony. And this would become a milestone in Montalto's life and would construct him as a successful historian and, more importantly, as a Portuguese patriot. So the first edition of Historic Macau was hailed as an ode to the Portuguese Empire. And Carlos Augusto Montalto de Jesus was celebrated even by the Macau government for his achievement. But what made him a celebrity would cause his downfall in the 1920s. So I will talk a bit about this later, but the second edition of Historic Macau would become a problem in the life of Montalto. And so he would die in Shanghai in 1932 in destitution. My last figure is Januario Agostinho de Almeida, who was born in Macau around 1887. He would move to Hong Kong in the 1890s. And so you can see that Januario is a bit different from the figures that I'd so far talked about. Leonardo, Eduardo, they had moved to Hong Kong as first generation settlers of the Macanese community. We see JP, Montalto, both of them Hong Kong born, Hong Kong raised and educated. But Januario was one amongst the many Macanese who grew up in Macau and then came to Hong Kong afterwards. And so they would show a stronger connection to Macau as their home. And Januario was very passionate about spreading Portuguese language, Portuguese culture, and in constructing Portuguese nationalism amongst his people. In 1914, for example, he would collect funds from the Macanese who were living in Macau, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Canton, and Manila. And he would use these funds to buy gifts for Portuguese soldiers who were fighting the war in France. And apart from that, in his free time, Januario was interested in spreading the Portuguese language, which by the late 1890s, early 1900s, not many Macanese, especially Hong Kong-born Macanese, could speak or write the Portuguese language. And so in his free time, he would teach Portuguese to adults and also to children with his wife, Karina. And he would work for the post office until his retirement in the 1930s, when he would finally move to Japan. He would, I think, return to Macau afterwards because he would die in Macau in 1954. So after introducing my 5 figures, all of you may already be thinking of one question, which is a question that I had to think about during my PhD, because my supervisor back then, Robert Vickers, always asked us the same question, which is, why should we care? Why should we care about these people? Why should we care about these information and sources that you just offered to me? And in my argument, these 5 narratives and the others that are featured in my monograph, they do show us something else about mixed race communities in East Asia and about the impacts of trans-imperial migration on such communities. They also tell us something about Hong Kong as a place with many networks to the outside world. And at the end of the presentation, I also hope to highlight how these stories can tell us something about ourselves as a human race. Leonardo's story, on the one hand, it does confirm and reveal that racial restrictions were, in fact, they were strong and they were existent in colonial Hong Kong, as they were in other colonial settings, and not just in colonial settings, because these are problems that are systemic and continue to exist today. But in the case of Leonardo, it gives us a window to see and to try to understand where these racial restrictions came from and how Europeans try to interpret such racial differences between whites and non-whites. And in the case of the Macanese, I found that there's a stereotypical perception of them mostly as Asiatics and non-Europeans. And with that, a lot of people were writing letters to local newspapers throughout the 19th century, some of them complaining about the Macanese, some of them saying that, well, the Macanese are good workers because They're Asiatics. They're used to the humid climate of southern China. They don't really eat a lot of expensive food. They can run like horses on a mill. And most importantly, one of these reports pointed out that, well, the Macanese, they don't drink. So it's okay to give them lesser pay because they don't drink. But of course, that's not true, because I remember that there's this diary that I've read from a clerk who worked for the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. And in it, he talked about a weekend where he got a loan from the bank. And he said that he used this loan to pay for his rent. And not just that, he got a loan, so he got to buy a box of port wine from a company called JJ Remedios. So from there, we know that, of course, it's not true that they don't drink. In fact, today, when I hang out with them, they do drink a lot. But these are some of the stereotypical perceptions that were given to mixed race communities, especially those that were born out of Asian port cities by the Europeans in the 19th century. But apart from that, the case of Leonardo also offers us a window to reassess whether racial restrictions and racial discrimination fully dictated the lives and career advancement of migrant communities like the Macanese. And I would argue that, of course, it's not suffice. It doesn't help us to look and to understand the entirety of what had happened back then, because the Macanese also had their weaknesses. But often when we say, oh, they were discriminated, and that was why Leonardo could not become the colonial secretary because he was not British. But the story is more than that. And it's a fact that the Macanese were not as strategic as some people who had connections to the Chinese underground. So one example I always give is a man called Daniel Caldwell, who was a Eurasian that lived in Hong Kong. He had a Chinese wife. He had networks to gambling dens, opium dens in Hong Kong. And he was appointed by the British government 3 or 4 times. And that was because he would be fired again and again. When someone found out that he had connections to gambling dens, he would be fired by the government. But time and again, the government would hire him and reappoint him because he was strategic. He had information about the Chinese people that the government had wanted. But for the most part, the Macanese tried to stay away from the Chinese community. So they did not quite mingle with the Chinese people, and they huddled amongst themselves and would prefer to hang out with other Eurasians, or if they could, British officials in the British community. And another point to make is that many of the Macanese who arrived in Hong Kong in the 19th century were not educated, because educational opportunities were very rare in Macau. The government didn't quite care to build a school for them, right? Leaving it to the hands of the Jesuits. So people like Leonardo would come to Hong Kong able to read and write general English, but then they would not be as strong a competitor as their other colleagues. And for the position of the colonial secretary, the competitor was someone who had a degree from Oxford. So if we sort of look at the picture in that sense, then we sort of start to see different things, right? We start to understand why the governor had not chosen Leonardo to be the colonial secretary. And to say that all Macanese were victims of racial discrimination is also quite unfair, because in the 19th century, I found quite a number of cases wherein the Macanese were appointed to quite higher ranking positions. Leonardo, when I looked at the Blue Book, which is a collection of the names of civil servants in Hong Kong and their salaries, I found that Leonardo was quite well paid. He was well paid, and much more than many of his British colleagues who worked as lower ranking clerks in the British office. And there's another example that I could give, which is that of a man called Alexander Grandpré, who was coincidentally the father-in-law of Leonardo de Almada Castro. So Grandpré, as early as the 1850s, was given the opportunity to become the superintendent of the Hong Kong police force. So he was appointed as the acting superintendent, and he was personally mentored by Charles May, who was well known at that time. But according to the records, Grandpré did not perform as was expected. So there's this source that I found which said that Grandpré would fail at all of the tasks that he had been given. And in the late 1850s, early 1860s, he was demoted to the position of collector of rates and lights, something like that. And the other source that I saw said that, oh, this position fits him well enough. It fits him perfectly because, you know, he's just not up to doing bigger and greater things. And I guess that this story right here shows us that, well, the Macanese did have their strengths, but also they did have, you know, certain areas where they were not as strong in competing for certain jobs as Europeans, you know, they had and they did. And so by looking at the Macanese solely as victims of racial discrimination, it flattens the actual dynamics that were happening in colonial workplaces. And from what I've seen of the narrative of Leonardo de Almada Castro, I saw that migrants like him and like many others like him, they willingly collaborated with the colonial government, with European offices. They happily worked. They were content with what they were earning because on the first place, they went to Hong Kong as migrants who had nothing. They wanted a better life. They wanted to build their families. They wanted jobs that Macau could no longer offer to them. And that they got in Hong Kong. And so this is something that we often oversee by just tagging these men and women as victims of racial discrimination. And significantly, the Macanese, they helped in running Hong Kong as the administrative backbone of the Hong Kong office and of European enterprises in the 19th century. Hong Kong was a destination for some, but it was also a springboard for others to transit to bigger, better things for them. It was a place that offered connections for further mobility. And this is what would happen to young Eduardo. As I said earlier, in 1859, Eduardo would leave the company Dent & Co. and he would move to London. And in London, I forgot to say this, but in Hong Kong, Eduardo would call himself Edward. So the English version of his name, because he wanted to become British and he wanted to mingle with the British people. But by the time he moved to London, he would become once again Eduardo. And according to records, he became Eduardo because he would start joining soirees and parties organized by lower nobility, and he would join them as, quoting, a Portuguese gentleman. And so in 1862, probably through the soirees that he was joining, he would marry the Honorable Margaret Stoner, who's the daughter of the 3rd Baron Camoys, Oxfordshire. And this would give him his ticket to lower nobility. So in the slide here, we're looking at Edward, also Eduardo later on, and his 2 children. So Sir Cecil Pereira and Sir George Edward Pereira. And if we run them through Google nowadays, we'll find that they're very well known as British military men who fought a number of wars for the British government. And by the time of the death of his children, I found that there's very little trace of their Macanese roots. In fact, I would say that there's no longer any trace of their Macanese roots. In an obituary for Cecil Pereira, I remember reading that Cecil's father was remembered as a Portuguese man who traded tobacco. But by that, I guess they meant opium. But they don't have records of that anymore. I don't know if they didn't know or they chosen to word it in another way. But either way, the story of Eduardo, it does show us that diasporic communities, they use trans-imperial migration in order to build networks from another empire and to use those networks as bridges and platforms for further class mobility, and some of them even for resettlement in Europe. And so as Eduardo, his case shows us that Macanese people tended to shift between quite a number of identities. Eduardo shifted between the Portuguese and the British worlds, and this proved the resilience of human individuals and communities. And as a result of this, what transpired in Hong Kong's urban spaces were new strands of Portugueseness, or Macanese-ness, if you want to call it that way. So one strand of this was represented by a club called Club Lusitano. So the painting right here shows the opening of the Club Lusitano. It's a ball, and that was, I think, in 1866. Club Lusitano would emerge as a middle-class, anglicized Portuguese club. And so that's reserved for those who were a bit wealthier and who had networks to each other. But more importantly, Club Lusitano would carve space for Macanese people who would be otherwise known as clerks to banks, to European offices, and in the government. It would allow them to shine in their tuxedos at night. So you imagine that there's this lower ranking clerk who works at the HSBC, and then at night he would go to a ball that's organized by Club Lusitano. They would invite the governor of the Hong Kong government. They would invite other prominent figures in Hong Kong, Chinese elites, and they would emerge as these gentlemen, prestigious gentlemen of equal status to their British counterparts at night. But Club Lusitano would become way too buttoned up, way too snobbish for some people, like Januario Agostinho de Almeida. So for those Macanese who arrived in Hong Kong from the 1880s onwards, especially those who came already grown up or as teenagers, they would find Club Lusitano as a space that was not very Portuguese. First of all, they were not welcome into Club Lusitano because they were not of the middle class. And second of all, they would find Club Lusitano too anglicized for their liking. And that was why in the 1890s, another club that was initially called Club de Recreo, but then it was changed to Club Vasco da Gama, would emerge. And there was one incident in 1898 that could really exemplify this division between the two clubs. So in 1898, Portuguese communities around the world were preparing to celebrate 400 years since the arrival of Vasco da Gama to India. And Club Lusitano called for a general meeting that could be attended by all Portuguese people in Hong Kong. But what happened was the president, who was then also the Portuguese consul of Hong Kong, he ended up just choosing 32 gentlemen to lead a commission to organize this event. And you can already start to imagine that these 32 men would have been members of Club Lusitano, middle class, his friends. And so those in Club Vasco da Gama got very angry. And they decided, you know what, I'm going to celebrate this 400 years of Vasco da Gama on my own. So I don't have to go to your party. I'll set up my own party. And this would lead to a very public spat. Club Lusitano would come out and say, you can't do this because we're organizing it and not you. And they would be writing on their own newspapers. So there are English and Portuguese language newspapers representing each of these clubs. And they would be writing and criticizing each other for being too anglicized, too middle class. And so it all boils down to certain questions of who was more Portuguese, who was more Macanese, who should have the authority to represent the Portuguese communities of East Asia. And these would be questions that would plague the Macanese community, not only in 1898, but it would continue to intensify throughout the early 1900s, 1920s and 1930s, as I will talk about a little later on. And it was also this question of what does it mean to be Portuguese? Who was more Portuguese than the other that would lead to the downfall of Montalto de Jesus in the 1920s. So in 1926, Montalto de Jesus would publish the second edition of his book, Historic Macau. And in it, there's a new chapter. And the new chapter talks about issues in Macau, because Macau was suffering financially, socially, politically. It was led by a very small group of oligarchs. And so Montalto would suggest that Macau be handed over to the League of Nations until the city could self-administer. And so basically he was criticizing the Portuguese government. He was saying that, Lisbon, it has been declining. It has its own problems. And so it doesn't have the competence anymore to administer Macau. At least if we want Macau to flourish, we need to take Macau out of the hands of these Portuguese people. And so writing this chapter led a lot of people to think, so is Montalto a patriot because he loves Macau? And he's speaking the truth about the Portuguese Empire and the Portuguese government. And there were also people who would, of course, be saying, well, he's a traitor, right? He's betraying us and the Portuguese nation by suggesting that Portugal is weak and that Macau needs to be handed over to the League of Nations. And finally, these discussions over various newspapers spread in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, in Japan, in Canton, and in Macau. They would drag on from 1926 to 1929. And by 1929, I saw a final report in a Shanghai newspaper wherein this writer says, I hope this will be the last letter on Montalto de Jesus that we'll ever see, because everyone's fed up. We'd had enough. But this case, either way, it shows us that by the 1920s, what was Portuguese had become a problem for the Macanese community. And adding that to the fact that there was now Club Lusitano, Club Vasco da Gama was gone by then. But there would be another club that I will talk about later that was more Portuguese than the others. And so while Montalto de Jesus himself became a martyr and sacrificed himself by speaking the truth about the Portuguese nation, J.P. Braga in 1929 would be living a very different life, because he would be welcomed to the Legislative Council of Hong Kong as the first unofficial Macanese member of the council. And he would be welcomed by the governor, Cecil Clementi, as, quoting, a son of Hong Kong. And that means a lot in the sense that J.P. Braga was the epitome of colonial-born subjects who prided on their imperial citizenship. And it's not just Braga who prided on being a Hong Kong-born Briton, but there were others like him, Chinese people who were born and educated here, Eurasians who were born and educated here, and all together, they would start to form a community by the 1920s. And these communities, they would engage in internationalist ideas. They would talk about the Washington Peace Conference. They would discuss how to make Hong Kong a more livable place, a better place, right? And from this development right here, we could see certain progresses in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong was now no longer just a colony of the British. It was becoming a home for domiciled communities. So people like J.P. Braga would strive to make Hong Kong a better place, especially for the predominant Chinese community, many of whom were still in the lower classes and could not speak for themselves and did not have a voice to speak up and talk about their grievances in life. And so J.P. Braga would show us that, well, there's now two very different strands of the Macanese. Montalto de Jesus was Hong Kong born and raised, but he chose to talk about the Portuguese Empire. He chose to become linked to the Lisbon Geographic Society. But J.P. Braga, he chose to acknowledge himself as a citizen of British Hong Kong. So this difference and this drift between the Macanese, it will become more and more apparent in the 1920s and 1930s. And we'll remember that this was a time when we're looking at global tides emerging regarding nationalism, new types of nationalism, right? Especially in Southeast Asia, we see that. And so while in modern Asia, we see the Straits Chinese straddling between the Chinese and British worlds during this time, we see Udang Malacca, Wu Tai Mang, or Shu Mang challenge the British authorities in Burma. In the Philippines, we see people like Benigno Ramos establishing newspapers such as Sakdal to promote independence of the Philippines. We see Januario de Almeida in Hong Kong actually trying to construct Portuguese nationalism. And he would do this by forming yet another new Portuguese club that was called Liga Portuguesa de Hong Kong. And Liga Portuguesa, I would say, was perhaps the most Portuguese and the most nationalistic organization to ever exist in Macanese history. So through Liga Portuguesa de Hong Kong, de Almeida would promote Portuguese education. he would try to promote Portuguese language by printing, for example, this periodical right here. They had their own newspaper called A Comunidade, which also served as a propaganda apparatus. So if you flip through this magazine and these newspapers, you see a lot of Salazar, for example. So this diasporic nationalism that Januario was trying to promote, it mirrors the diasporic nationalism that the Germans had and depicted during their time in Shanghai, when they openly supported the Nazi government. But Januario de Almeida would also try to use the Portuguese language to try to attempt to sort of, flame the Portuguese sense of belonging amongst and within the Macanese people, because he had realized that after almost 100 years in Hong Kong, many Macanese now, they don't care about Macau, they don't care about Portuguese Empire, they don't speak Portuguese language anymore. And so we have to change that. And it was, in fact, under the initiation of Januario that in 1934, if my memory serves me right, that the first ever sermon to be delivered in the Portuguese language would take place in Hong Kong, in Tsim Sha Tsui. So imagine from the 1840s to the 1930s, the Macanese people going to church every single week, but not one of them suggesting that we should do this in Portuguese, or not having succeeded in initiating one. But Januario succeeded in doing that in the 1930s. One of the things that I think we can take away from these 5 narratives is how diasporic migrant communities or diasporic communities, they reveal Hong Kong as a vibrant place where connections were forged by its migrants. So often when we talk about the Macanese in Hong Kong, we see a very simple story of how migrant communities helped to build with their sweat and blood Hong Kong from literally a barren rock into a cosmopolitan city. This narrative has been retold plenty of times before. But if we look at these narratives and try to connect the achievements of these men and their pursuits with their own personal experiences and their historical backgrounds, we'll find that Hong Kong was much more than that. Hong Kong served as a land of opportunities for its migrants. It served as a stepping stone for people like Eduardo. It was a place of class ascension, especially for those who joined Club Lusitano, who would not have had this opportunity if they were in Macau. This was also a place for the construction of new types of Portugueseness and of diasporic nationalism. And it also gives us a different look at the colonial setting. As many literature or a strand of literature would inform us, colonial settings were often very, very rigid spaces, right? And I don't deny that. I don't deny that racial discrimination was there in Hong Kong and still is everywhere in this world right now. But from the stories of these 5 men, we come to acknowledge that the colonial setting also provided very liberal spaces for its migrants. And through these liberal spaces, migrant communities, they acquired the agency to dream, to navigate, to bargain, to survive, and also to strive using the tools that they had acquired from their place of, their homeland and also their host land. And so by doing so, we can acknowledge these people as much more than just an ethnic minority or colonized subject, which often we see being used as tags to describe the Macanese community. And their stories certainly echo what Karl Marx once wrote, which is quoting, "Men make their own history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing." So although the Macanese were blinded by their own identity disputes, I think that the way they shifted between various identities certainly reveals that identities are very diverse. They're transient and they shapeshift and they drift across the sky very quickly. And because of that, I think that even though the narratives of the Macanese do add up to reveal wider developments in the histories of East Asia, of the Portuguese Empire, and of Hong Kong, Their narratives show that every individual is a unique speck of dust in this vast humanity, that underneath our skin color, our bank accounts, underneath our identity orientations, which can shift from day to day, no two people's experiences can be painted using the same brush and using the same color palette. So I always see history as sort of like a kaleidoscope, especially when I look at history through the lenses of personal stories like these 5 people that I had mentioned. Every time I reread their personal narratives, I see a different pattern to Hong Kong history, for example. And although I've talked about the lives of these 5 men, I hadn't talked about why Leonardo didn't leave his job. I mean, I talked a bit about it, right? But the fact was that Leonardo had a family to raise, and he was the only person working in his family. He was taking care of not only his wife and his daughters, but also his brother-in-laws. So we have evidence that shows that, and that explains why for Leonardo, well, racial discrimination was a pain, but his life was much more than that. He lived a life beyond such restrictions. And I didn't talk about why Eduardo would move to Hong Kong. And I suspect that was because Eduardo had dozens of cousins and dozens of brothers and sisters, and competition was very stiff in a declining Macau. And so he would move to Hong Kong in 1840s to try to look for his own place under the sun. And I also didn't talk about why JP had this passion to fight for racial equality amongst workers in Hong Kong. And I guess that was because before JP returned to Hong Kong, while he was in Calcutta, he had dreamt of becoming a lawyer. He had plans of going to the United Kingdom to become a barrister. But Noronha, Delfino Noronha, his grandfather, had asked him to go back to Hong Kong because he needed a hand, he needed help with his company. And so JP always had that passion to fight for people who didn't have voices in him. But, you know, understanding this by looking at his own personal experiences gives us a better idea of why they were doing what they did. And finally, I hope that these biographical narratives that I had mentioned and the others that I hadn't talked about but are in my monograph, they add up to prompt us to remember and to acknowledge that people, as Jose Ortega y Gasset once said, are who they are plus their circumstances. And I hope that by remembering this is very basic, I know, but we often forget, right? We're blinded by a lot of stereotypical ideas. We're blinded by a lot of social constructs. And hopefully this will remind us that, you know, by acknowledging people as not only their skin color, but also their upbringing, their education, their experiences in life will help to move humanity forward to a world of less hatred and more understanding, greater solidarity, and compassion, of course, as one human race. So that is that for my presentation. Thank you very much.